Well, many thanks for this kind invitation to join this very first webinar on the current state and future outlook for civil aviation. This is a particularly difficult time for aviation. The sector has been very hard hit by the pandemic, probably more than any other sector of the economy. And as everybody's aware, it can be very difficult at times for airlines to make a profit. Next slide, please. You can see here that when we compare airlines with other businesses, the return on invested capital is often much lower in airlines than other sectors. We've already alluded to some of the problems of, for example, issuing too many licenses for airlines, creating too much competition. There are all kinds of factors that lead to lower profitability. This is maybe why Richard Branson, who founded Virgin Airlines, once said that if you want to be a millionaire, you start with $1 billion and then launch an airline. It can be very difficult to sustain profitability. And one of the reasons for this is because of the pattern of demand for air travel, which tends to be very cyclical, and is also affected by periodic crises that really impact on the industry. Next slide, please. So you can see here what we call the pro-cyclical pattern of demand. So when the economy is doing well, civil aviation tends to do very well. But when the economy does badly, civil aviation tends to do even worse. So when the economy goes into a recession, civil aviation usually fares much worse. So the general pattern is air travel follows the general pattern of demand in the economy, but in a more exaggerated way with even bigger ups and downs. And a lot of the downturns can be sparked by external events, things like oil price rises, wars, and of course, pandemics. Next slide, please. So you can see here the way in which oil price rises, wars, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the financial crisis, it kind of flattens the growth curve. With a different horizontal scale, you would see these as much bigger dips in demand. But what you can see quite clearly is the impact of COVID-19, this unprecedented decline in traffic. It can be something of a cliche when people say that demand has fallen off a cliff, but this is exactly what this looks like, this huge decline in demand as a result of the pandemic. So if you look in more detail at air passenger volumes, these are some of the latest data from IATA, which is this huge decline and a very slow recovery. So this is the passenger kilometers, revenue passenger kilometers. And you can see how there has been a better recovery, if we can call it that, in domestic travel, because international borders have been closed. But again, we're still talking about traffic volumes 60, 80% less than they were in the previous year. We're currently looking in more detail at the impact of the pandemic in Europe. And in particular, at the moment, we're looking at the impact on air navigation services. Next slide, please. But again, if you look at, this is a more detailed weekly pattern, week by week in Europe. So the red line and the blue lines show you what's been happening during the pandemic compared to the light blue line, which is the comparable data for 2019. So in Europe, we can see that we're still 80, 60% below the level of the previous year. Next slide, please. So in different countries, different regions around the world, you can see that load factors are significantly down. But when we look at particular countries, we might be able to see how we might get a recovery from the pandemic. So next slide. So what we see in China, this is only for domestic travel, obviously. But as the number of cases, the number of COVID cases fell, traffic has recovered and recovered quite well. So in Europe, we're basing our modeling for the recovery of air traffic on different scenarios for the impact of the vaccine and how that might impact on travel. So next slide, please. So Eurocontrol, which is the network manager for Europe, currently has three scenarios, three forecasts based on different scenarios for the vaccine. So the first scenario is that the vaccine is widely available and we have some kind of end to the pandemic by the late summer of this year. But that means that traffic will only return to the 2019 level by 2024. So another four years. The second scenario, which is seen to be the most likely, is that the vaccine becomes more widely available. And so we have some kind of end to the pandemic by the summer of next year, which means that traffic will only return to the 2019 level by the year 2026, so an even longer recovery. If the vaccines prove not to be effective, then we could have a longer term impact on passenger confidence, and then traffic will only return to the 2019 levels by 2029. And of course, there's even more uncertainty because we're unsure how, for example, business travel might recover. Everybody's hoping that tourist travel will recover quite quickly, but we may have more business meetings like this through webinars rather than people traveling. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic illustration of the different scenarios that are being forecast for traffic in Europe. And you can see this is going to take a long time to recover, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about whether or not traffic will return back to 2019 levels. On the most optimistic scenario, scenario 2, traffic will still be 10% less than in 2019 by the year 2024. And obviously, the situation is going to be similar in other regions around the world, and it will obviously be much worse where the rollout of the vaccine is much slower, which means that everybody is going to face a very difficult time ahead in the future. Now, I think what's important to note is that a lot of the past policies used by airlines to get them through a crisis might not work as well this time around, not only because of the severity of the crisis, but also because of this uncertainty about the composition of travel in the future. So will business travel recover, or will there be a longer term decline because more meetings are being held remotely rather than in person or face to face? So if we look at the last two major crises after 9/11 and then the global financial crisis, we can reflect here on the kind of policies that aviation unions around the world found more or less acceptable as a way to try to protect jobs and protect workers' terms and conditions of employment. These data come from two studies that we conducted for the International Labour Organization. As you no doubt know, the International Labour Organization is a tripartite organization. So we also collected information from employers as well. But here, we've just reported on the data from trade unions, from aviation unions. There were 35 unions that responded to our survey after 9/11, and then 61 unions who responded after the financial crisis from 2008. What we can see here is that there is a very clear preference for voluntary as opposed to compulsory measures. So unions are much more supportive of voluntary early retirements or voluntary severance. They're much more in favor of a freeze on recruitment, short-time working, shorter working weeks, pay freezes, kind of temporary measures that try to get you through an immediate crisis. But all those measures are clearly designed as short-term measures rather than addressing some of the longer term problems and perhaps some of the major restructuring that we'll see as a result of this crisis through things like mergers and acquisitions. Next slide, please. So we also asked unions about their support for different policies introduced by governments, simply about whether they are agreed or disagreed. These results are rather predictable. I mean, it is unlikely that trade unions would disagree with financial support from the government for things like pensions or severance pay or retraining programs or short-time working or medical and health insurance. But in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the questions on mergers, takeovers and consolidation. And then also the question on promoting social dialogue, consultation. So we find that unions are clearly not in favour of mergers and acquisitions. And as Joseph just said, that's because these mergers and takeovers often have poor outcomes for workers. There's almost unanimous support for unions to be involved in negotiations, in consultation over these changes. And we've already heard in the case of Korea that the unions have not been involved in this process so far. So we know what the general position is for trade unions and in the situations of mergers and acquisitions. And so it's pretty clear where we stand on this issue in solidarity with everybody in Korea over the current situation. Final slide, please. So I just want to say a few things about mergers and acquisitions because we have more detailed contributions to follow. The first point to make is to establish what the legal position is in terms of company law, competition law, employment law. So in Europe, for example, we have laws on the transfer of undertakings that can often be used when one company effectively takes over another. We can use that legislation to try to protect workers' interests. In the United States, the process tends to be dominated more by legal issues. And quite often, the outcome for workers can depend on how much money the union can afford in terms of legal fees, in terms of trying to represent the interests of their members. We also need to ask, what are workers' rights to information and consultation? And I'm sure our colleagues from Europe will talk more about this. But in Europe, workers have legal rights to information. We have supervisory boards with worker directors. We have company councils. We have European works councils. So we have more opportunities to gather information about the merger and the process. So the second point here is how important it is to understand the business case or the rationale for a particular merger or an acquisition. Again, as already been said in the case of Korea, we know that governments are often very active behind the scenes supporting a particular merger. So, for example, that was certainly the case when Air Canada took over Canadian, which from the union's perspective was not a successful merger. We know that when Lufthansa decided to sell British Midland International, BMI, British Airways only wanted to buy the BMI mainland part of that business. And the main reason for that was that they wanted BMI's slots at Heathrow Airport. There was no buyer for the low-cost subsidiary, BMI Baby. So we need to understand what is driving the merger, because clearly that will impact certain groups of employees more than others. If they're on, for example, in that example, the workers in British Airways, in BMI mainland, their jobs were more secure, obviously, than the workers at the low-cost subsidiary BMI Baby. So it's really important to understand the business plan and any political maneuverings behind the scene, because that will have a major impact on jobs, on careers, where employees might be asked to work and their terms and conditions of employment. Now, I think there are two other factors that are especially important in merger negotiations, and that often relates to the status and seniority of pilots. Merging seniority lists for pilots can be very contentious, especially if the unions that are concerned don't come together early on and agree on principles. But that can also affect the outcomes for other groups of workers as well. So again, to echo the point that Joseph made at the start, it's really important to have cooperation between the unions and to agree on some principles for that. A good example of this was when the Canadian regional airlines were merged. And there it was decided to fix pay related to status rather than the types of aircraft that, that pilots were flying. And that proved to be much more effective in trying to bring these different groups together as a way of sharing some of the benefits. So I think there's a lot we can learn from the experience of aviation unions, both through transnational mergers, but also national mergers. But I think the most important thing that comes out of all these examples is the need to build trust and cooperation between the unions that have members in different airlines, because outcomes are always better for workers when the workers and the trade unions are united in these situations. Thank you very much.